I have good news and I have bad news. Which do you want to hear first? I bet you've heard that before. And usually, we'd say, I just prefer good news. Don't even bother with the bad news. We're going to investigate some good news, bad news scenarios in our text this morning. At Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 10, a natural transition seems to occur in the movement of the book. The refrain, chasing after the wind, appears for the last time in chapter 6, verse 9, having recurred repeatedly in the first half of the book. According to Dave Bland, it appears that chapter 6, verses 10 through 12, transitions the reader to the second half of the book and introduces two dominant themes: the quest to find out what is good and the human perplexity of not knowing. Verses 10 through 12 serve as a summary statement for the writer, identifying for him what makes life so perplexing. The verses offer theological reflections on the nature of human existence and on the being of God. We need to admit that humans are constrained by the limitations of their fragile nature. Humans must also live in the face of uncertainty. Verses 10 through 12 set the frailty of human life against the supremacy of God. What is the conclusion? For who knows what is good for a man in life? The answer is God knows. Now this leads Solomon to introduce a whole series of proverbs. 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 32 says that Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs and his songs numbered 1,005. It's not surprising that Solomon includes several proverbs in the book of Ecclesiastes. Our text today makes use of the better than formula that we saw earlier in chapter 4 verses 6, 9, and 13. Some things are better than others. Solomon gives wise ways to choose in a world of great uncertainty. These better than comparisons contrast what may be pleasant with what is wise, what is momentarily appealing with what is of lasting value. One writer said, "There are times when bad is better." We probably all have memories from our childhood of having to take liquid medicines that tasted terrible. But the good news was that the bad tasting medicine would make us feel better. Tommy South says of these kind of proverbs, the better than proverbs, one thing is compared with another, usually to show that something which may not seem better actually is. Some things on his better list would not be on ours. Yet these short proverbs bring home some of life's most crucial realities. Read with me from Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. For death is the destiny of every man. The living should take this to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. It is better to heed a man's wise rebuke than to listen to the song of fools. Like the crackling thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. This too is meaningless. Extortion turns a wise man into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. The end of a matter is better than its beginning, and patience is better than pride. Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. Do not say, "Why were the old days better than these?" For it is not wise to ask such questions. Solomon's verse first says, real character and integrity are better than making a good external impression. The first part of verse 1 of chapter 7. A good name is better than fine perfume. Here, a name is not just a label, but it is an accurate reflection of our nature. Michael Eaton speaks of a reputation which flows from character. The most precious of perfumes cannot cover the stink of a bad character. Here, precious ointment would indicate someone who has wealth. But being wealthy is not a substitute for having a good reputation. Proverbs 22:1 says, "A good name is more desirable than great riches. To be esteemed is better than silver or gold." There are two occasions when our name is especially significant: at birth and at death. Those two dates usually have a dash between them on a person's tombstone. Birth is filled with promise, but what happens during the dash, the time between birth and death, has lasting consequences and significance. Michael Eaton observed, "As inner character is more crucial than outer fragrance, so it is the funeral, not the rowdy birthday party, that poses the ultimate questions about life the preacher is pressing." This severe statement arises not from despondency, but from sheer realism. A second point Solomon makes is death and grief are better than birth and gladness. Verses 1b through verse 4. And we find this statement puzzling. We celebrate birthdays and mourn at death. Solomon is not talking about what we enjoy more, but what is better for us. And what is good for us is not always what we enjoy. Now, death cannot be enjoyed, but it is our avenue to eternal life. The death of Christ opened heaven for us, and our own death allows us to enter his presence forever. A house of mourning is better than a house of feasting, because only the sober realities of death and grief can teach us some lessons. After all, death is the end, or should be the end, of a race well run. One learns more about life from a wake than from a wedding. Verse 2 of chapter 7 speaks of the reality of our own mortality. That is, one of the most important lessons learned is in a house of mourning. We need to remember that every funeral that we attend anticipates our own. Solomon goes further by claiming that sorrow is better than laughter, and that a sad face is good for the heart. Well, how can sadness make us happy? Another way of translating verse 3b is, "By sadness of countenance, the heart is put right." Or as the Good News Bible renders it, "Sorrow may sadden your face, but it sharpens your understanding." It is not that sorrow brings gladness, but that sorrow is an excellent, though painful teacher. We need to learn its lessons. Verse 4 reemphasizes the fact that those who reject the lessons of sorrow in favor of dwelling always in the house of pleasure are fools indeed. Pleasure does not teach the vital lessons of life. Funerals remind us of the unpleasant but critical truth that all of us will die. A wise person squarely faces that life on earth is fragile and temporary. This understanding affects how we live. It is in facing the reality of one's own mortality that a person can enjoy life in its truest sense. Pain and sorrow are far better teachers than pleasure. Probably in your school years you had a teacher who was the fun teacher. He didn't require a lot from you. Usually, we did not learn as much in that class as we did in the class of the tough teacher. Thomas Gray wrote, "Elegy written in a country churchyard. The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, all that beauty and all that wealth ever gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave." Now the Bible does say, Proverbs in fact does say, that laughter is sometimes better than sorrow. A happy heart makes the face cheerful, but heartache crushes the spirit. A cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. Yes, it is good to have laughter. It is good to be happy, but a happiness based upon reality, a happiness that is balanced with sober thought. Sober thought in the long run is better than partying. Bad times have a far greater impact on our hearts than times of ease. Jesus himself learned through suffering. Then Solomon observes, wisdom, even in the form of a rebuke, is better than the empty chatter of fools. Verse 6 has a bit of a pun in Hebrew. The crackling of thorns under the pot, like the crackling of thorns under the pot. Well, how do you translate that into English and retain the pun? Well, Moffat said it's like nettles cracking under kettles. Because they provided quick combustion, dry thorns were often used to start a fire. However, they do not give off much heat, but they do make a lot of noise. Such is the nature of the song of fools. It makes a lot of noise, but it imparts little substance. Foolishness does have its attraction. For one thing, fools usually say what you want to hear. But what is it worth? Wise words may hurt, but they may also help. It is important to accept the explicit reproof of the wise. Now, being corrected is painful to the ego. Our first impulse is to reject it. You should probably be thankful that a long time ago, that Fran Young told me one time, I can read the Bible class book for myself. I was reading from the book that everybody had a copy of. If they had read the book, I needed to say something else rather than just reading it to them. It was painful, but it was helpful. Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of the fool seems right to him, but a wise man listens to advice. The willingness to receive counsel and correction from wiser heads is critical. The wise who admonish are those who are wise in the ways of God. They have our best interest at heart. Yes, it is more pleasant to listen to the mindless approval of fools. It is hazardous to be seduced by their fawning compliments. Proverbs chapter 27, verse 6. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. What is it? Flattery will get you anywhere. We have to be very suspicious when a person flatters us too much. We should cherish those friends who care enough for us to correct us, even at the risk of the relationship. We all need the courage and good sense to accept correction, even if it is painful. A preacher was accused by a brother in Christ of being a liar. The preacher asked an older preacher for counsel in dealing with the accusation. The older preacher's first response was to ask, well, are you? We needed to get that criticism out of the way. Was it true or not? And then in our text, Solomon says, the end of a thing is better than its beginning, verses 8 through 10. The end of a matter is better than its beginning, and patience is better than pride. Why is the end better than the beginning? Because by the end, we know the whole picture. We can see the outcome of a project, even a life. How many projects have you started that you haven't finished? Now, preacher, you've gone to middle. No. It's easy to start a project, isn't it? More difficult to complete it. At the birth of a baby, there is the celebration, and there should be. But we don't know what that baby's going to turn out to be. But at the end of one's life, we can reflect on what was accomplished in that life. Yet another professor at Oklahoma Christian, I never had him for a class, but knew him, has died. Read his obituary. Some interesting things were said about his birth. It mentioned his parents, but then it said he was raised by an uncle and aunt. Don't know about the beginning. Some do. But all of the things that happened after his birth leading up to his death, oh, what an amazing story of the life of Max Dobson. And we should work that it will be the same for us. Our end should be better than our beginning. And if the end of a matter is better than its beginning, that means that patience is of tremendous importance. Solomon counsels us not to become quickly angered or to wish for the former days. Too often we talk about the good old days, and our memories are somewhat skewed. We remember the good parts and not the bad. We need the patience to see important projects of our lives through to completion. After all, something may begin poorly and turn out extremely well. When we study these words in their context, we must agree that they are right. Some things which are not easy or pleasant are indeed better than the easy, quick pleasures of life. They are the good news. We must be wise enough to look down the different paths before us and determine where they are leading. It is not how we begin, but how we end that matters. Again, Solomon says anger and impatience are found in the heart of a fool. Basically, one cannot face the difficulties of one age by pining for another. The past is gone. We can learn something from it. The future is unknown. But here we are today. We can live in anticipation of the future. We can live in such a way that our end will be good. And so it is not the circumstances of life under the sun that determine the wisdom of our course, but what God will judge it to be at journey's end. John Oxenham long ago wrote a poem entitled The Ways. To every man there openeth a way, and ways, and a way. And the high soul climbs the highway, and the low soul gropes the low. And in between, on the misty flats, the rest drift to and fro. But to every man there openeth a highway and a low. And every man decideth, the way his soul shall go. Yes, there are those who aspire to the highway. There are many who aspire to the low way. But then there are those, many, who just end up on the misty flats of mediocrity. That is not where God would have his children dwell. In our text, Solomon presents his readers with choices. His instruction is to take the better road, the road of divine wisdom. This is the better choice. The world may not think so, but the child of God, the one following God, will consider this to be the good news.